This is Garis, Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 631, entitled A Probable Interview of a Masculist Spokesman by a Feminist Journalist. Description. This flyer imagines a near-future interview of a masculine spokesman by a monoconscious feminist media journalist who has a mainstream mass audience of millions of people. Her initial attitude towards the masculist is misandrist, but on listening to his points, she hesitates. The flyer itself. A probable interview of a masculist spokesman by a feminist journalist by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer imagines a near-future interview of a masculist spokesman who speaks for the masculist movement to a monoconscious feminist media journalist who has a mass audience of several million viewers over a major country. That is, an interview that could provide a real breakthrough of masculist ideas to the general public. It takes the form of a dialogue between the masculist and the feminist, but before it is presented here, some general remarks are needed. Firstly, why hasn't such an interview already occurred, given that the manosphere, in brackets, that is men on the internet talking about men's gender issues, close brackets, has been around for several decades? I think the main reason is that attempts to achieve such a media breakthrough by the manosphere have been blocked by the fem mafia, that's the feminist media mafia, who interpret masculist criticism of women as just more male chauvinism and misogyny, and hence block it, thus suppressing the equal right of men to complain about how women oppress men, as women have to complain about how men oppress women, so are seen by the masculists as arch hypocrites. So, given this fem mafia, why do I think that such a major media breakthrough is likely in only a short time, that is, within the next few years? Because of the effect of the MGTOWing, in brackets, equals men going their own way, of men. In brackets, quoting Google, quote, a recent Pew, PW, research study suggests a tectonic shift in the dating and sex life of men. The study found that among men under 30 years old, over 60% are single, almost double that of women in the same age bracket. End quote. Obviously, that alarming stat is going to have a profound impact on women. A substantial proportion of women are not going to have boyfriends, nor sex, nor babies, etc. So sooner or later, women, particularly monoconscious feminists, will be forced to ask themselves, quote, what is happening with men? That nearly 2/3 of them are now refusing to date women, leaving women rotting on the shelf. What's going on? This questioning by monoconscious feminist journalists will probably be prompted by a greater pressure coming from their young female readers and viewers who are pushing the same question as a result of their difficulty in finding boyfriends who are prepared to even date them, let alone sexing them. So imagine the scene with a thoroughly monoconscious feminist journalist with a mass audience sitting on a sofa in a TV studio with a biconscious masculist facing her, and the interview is about to start. This is how I imagine the interview will probably go. Imagining this will require an ability on my part to think in the mindset of both the feminist and the masculist. I have no problem with the masculist mindset, since I am one in real life. But putting myself in the head of a monoconscious feminist is more difficult since I'm male, and it's difficult to imagine how such a woman would see the world. But judging by how a lot of women think, and the opinions they express. This is my best guess on how the interview might unfurl. We start with the Feminist, written simply as F. My statements begin with M. F. Quote, "This evening we have a rather unusual guest who labels himself as a masculist, which viewers can readily guess is the male equivalent of a feminist. That is, someone who fights for men's rights. He's not only a masculist, but a retired professor in computer science, so is obviously no dummy, although we will soon see if the ideas of the men's lib movement that he presents makes any sense. His name is Professor Dr. Hugo de Garis." Turning towards her guest. "Professor de Garis, I looked at some of the essays on your website and frankly I was horrified by the level of hatred and misogyny you show towards women. So why should we women pay you any attention at all? I think nearly any woman reading your deeply misogynist ideas would cross you off in a microsecond. So how on earth do you justify your incredible hatred towards women?" End quote. M. Quote, "Masculists have a hatred towards gender criminal women who commit horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men that any reasonable person of either sex would agree deserve hatred. Common sense says that some things should be hated. Feminism is a deeply misandrist, genocentric ideology that preaches to women and to society that gender oppression is a one-way street, that women are the oppressed and men are the oppressors. So since you're probably half my age, that means that all your life you have been brainwashed by the 6 decades lasting feminist monopoly over gender politics, that gender oppression is a one-way street. Feminism says nothing about how women oppress men. To learn about how women oppress men, you have to have your masculist consciousness raised, which would make you a biconscious feminist. That is, you would no longer be a monoconscious feminist who has only had her feminist consciousness raised. As a biconscious feminist, that is, you have had both your feminist and your masculist consciousnesses raised, you will become very aware that gender oppression is very much a two-way street. And in fact, that women's oppression of men is way worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men are horrible and last decades, so should be hated by both sexes, so that these gender criminal women who commit these horrible gender crimes against men are punished, so they stop committing these gender crimes. Since you are monoconscious, judging by your opening remarks, you are probably unaware of how women commit horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men. So I'll give you 3 of the worst gender crimes that women commit against men, so that you can think about them, and then hopefully come to agree with the masculists that gender oppression is definitely a two-way street, and that women commit worse gender crimes against men than vice versa. The big 3 gender crimes that women commit against men are, and I'd ask you and the viewers to memorize these big 3, since they are indeed horrible gender crimes that cause masculists to have a real hatred against women who commit them. The big 3 are dash: women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering. Since this is only a short interview, I don't have time to elaborate much on these big 3 gender crimes that women commit against men. But if you do think about them, you will come to realize that they are indeed horrible and deserve to be hated, which is why, thanks to the rise of the manosphere, that is men talking about men's issues on the internet, that there are a growing number of female masculists now who feel real sympathy towards the masculists and agree with masculist ideas. But nearly all feminists today are still monoconscious, who see men as oppressors of women, so not surprisingly are angry with men, so are not nice to be with for men, since men don't want to have relationships with, speaking bluntly, in brackets, quote, misandrist, monoconscious, feminazi cunts, and refused to have anything to do with them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at. F. I think nearly all the women listening to these words are shocked at the level of hatred coming from you. M. Interrupting. Put yourself in the shoes of a divorcing father in the hated, that is by Masculists, fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court system, where one father in 4 is butchered, and ask yourself whether you would not feel hatred at what is happening to men in the divorce courts. By the way, I have used the word fluffy above, which is a masculist label for a traditional woman who expects to be able to live off the money and labour of a man, leeching off him for decades, manslaving him, and for one father in 4, divorce raping him. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being a manslave to women, working for a woman for decades of his life. Masculists have a very powerful argument to pressure women to FIP up, that is, become a FIP, a financially independent person, and not fluffy style, expect to leech off a man's money for decades. And that argument is that, thanks to men's discovery of science-based medicine, women now have a life expectancy of 85 years. And with the male invention of the pill, household gadgets, and higher education, women have a career window of half a century. So the masculists, who are abolitionists, are now standing up, pointing the finger at women, saying, now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is manslavery, and manslavery will get women killed slowly by being totally ignored by masculistic men, who in time will be nearly all men, as masculist ideas spread across the planet the way feminist ideas have. Masculists have 2 main enemies: the fluffies, who masculists see as manslaving, divorce-raping vermin, and the fluffy feminists, whom the masculists have an even greater hatred of, since it's bad enough that they are fluffies, and hence manslaving, divorce-raping vermin. But they are also seen by masculists as hypocrites and indirect genociders. They are seen as hypocrites since feminists want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men by not bothering to share equally the burden of earning the living by behaving as fluffies in the divorce courts, by not bothering to FIP up in high school and college, bothering to get a career competent education that will make them FIPs as adults, and not expecting fluffy style to parasite off the money and labour of a man, making her the hated enemy of the masculists, who are abolitionists, who see manslavery as literally 1,000 times bigger problem than was Negro slavery, given the numbers of manslaves in the world today. The fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges have made divorce so toxic for men that in many countries now 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, and live the MGTOW, MGTOW lifestyle, thus crashing the birth rate. Hence, indirectly, the fluffy feminists are genociders, wiping out whole populations, so of course are hated by the masculists. You can imagine how a biconscious masculist reacts towards a monoconscious feminist, as is happening right now. From the perspective of a monoconscious feminist, masculist hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists is just more misogyny that the feminists have been fighting for decades. So typically, a monoconscious feminist just crosses off a masculist in seconds for his misogyny. From the perspective of the biconscious masculist, who does not disagree with the feminist that men oppress women, the callous indifference towards men, particularly towards how women oppress men with the big 3 gender crimes of manslavery, divorce, rape, and forced fathering, that I have not had the time to elaborate on, but you can type these terms into Google and educate yourself. This feminist callousness towards men is truly hated by the masculists. So masculists terrify young women, threatening them that if they don't become monoconscious, If they become monoconscious feminazis, then that will be the kiss of death for them in terms of getting a man, since masculist and manosphere ideas have now spread so far amongst young men that even monoconscious feminists like you are now giving the masculists a platform on the mainstream media. Biconscious masculists have no patience nor tolerance for monoconscious feminists and force them to rot on the shelf by being totally ignored, not even pumped and dumped. Masculists claim that it is in a monoconscious feminist's self-interest to become biconscious. That is, by learning some masculinist ideas, so that her feminist anger at men is cancelled by her masculinist anger at women, so that she loses her feminazi bitchiness and becomes much nicer towards men, and hence is more likely to keep her boyfriend, partner, husband, son. Masculists target such men, teaching them masculist ideas so that they become bi-conscious, so that if their feminist girlfriends, partners, wives, mothers remain monoconscious, these men will become disgusted at these women's bigotry and then dump them. Masculism is a huge topic, as is feminism, so I have only scratched the surface of what masculists have to say. If you want to know more about the topic, especially if you are young and your boyfriend is becoming increasingly hostile towards your feminist monoconsciousness, then just Google some of the masculist terms I have used in this interview. F. Food for thought. After reading your essays, I had imagined that you would be a raving lunatic in this interview, but you do have some strong points, so I will be Googling masculist topics in the future. So thank you, Professor de Garis, for appearing on this show this evening. M. Thanks for giving me a platform to present masculist ideas to a mass audience. Oh, by the way, don't let your husband see you searching on Google for masculist ideas in case he gets infected